And now, please welcome to the stage the speakers for this session. Martin Kessler, Executive Director, Finance for Development Lab at Paris School of Economics. Andy McKay, Professor at University of Sussex. Kwame Owino, Chief Executive Officer at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Before giving the floor to the chair for this session, we will view a short introductory video for the panel.
The current economic context in Africa is marked by a persistent rise in vulnerabilities, particularly those related to increasing debt. This raises serious concerns about the ability of African nations to prevent the risk of over-indebtedness while maintaining rigorous fiscal discipline. This task is even more difficult in a political context marked by upcoming elections in many African countries, where pressures for increased spending and popular initiatives risk undermining economic stabilization efforts. Faced with such challenges, it becomes imperative to rethink budget management on the continent by promoting greater discipline and rigor. How can African governments balance the need for increased spending on social programs, infrastructure development, and climate with the need for fiscal discipline? How can African nations improve their debt management strategies to ensure long-term fiscal sustainability? What innovative tools and technologies can be used to improve budget transparency and accountability in Africa?
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this session on addressing fiscal discipline. As we gather here, we are actually aware of the significant macroeconomic challenges facing African countries, especially when it comes to managing public debt and maintaining fiscal discipline. It's true that Africa has recently seen some positive shifts in its macroeconomic situation. Inflation is down, growth has started to pick up, fiscal consolidation continues, and we have seen that the fiscal deficit is back to an average of 4% of GDP in the last year. Also, public debt has stabilized around 60%, and on the top of that, Africa is once again becoming attractive to investors, given the increase of FDI recorded the last year. So there are definitely some signs of optimism which can indicate a continuation of the post-pandemic recovery. However, we should not overlook the fact that the outlook remains fragile. Africa is still susceptible to global shocks with the weaker external demand and the high geopolitical risk. We also have to deal with the increase in political instability in some countries and frequent climate shocks. And with elections coming up in 18 African countries, there is an intense pressure on governments to raise spending on popular initiatives. These factors together make the future of the macroeconomic situation quite uncertain. I'm looking forward to hearing from our esteemed panelists on what they think from their own perspectives. Remember that our discussions today is not only about giving or identifying problems or giving diagnostics. It's also about proposing solutions and sparking new ideas. So I will start with Mr. Andy McKay, professor at the University of Sussex in England. I would like to remind you of our proceeding. So we will all have a maximum of 10 minutes for your presentations. We will move on to a 30-minute Q&A session. before we wrap up the discussion. So, Mr. Andy, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you very much to the Policy Centre for the invite. It's a pleasure to be here and to share this excellent meeting with you. So quite a lot of the points I'm going to talk about here were already discussed in both the introductory video there, but also in what Chris was saying earlier about the growth of debt. That's a chart from a recent Afreximbank report just to show the evolution of debt. And what we see there, this is debt to GDP in African countries, and we see with the HIPC and the Multilateral Debt Relief Initiative, debt coming down. But since that, debt-GDP ratio is increasing substantially. And this is not just about COVID. There's an uptake at the time of COVID, but debt was starting to substantially increase before that point. And already in about 2015, 2016, African debt was crossing what was felt to be the appropriate metric in terms of debt sustainability. Now, the nature of debt in Africa has changed. It's not so much foreign currency debt as it used to be. There's more domestic debt. There's more private sector debt. There have been quite a few bond issues and so on. So the nature of debt has changed, but that has got pluses and minuses. Less foreign currency debt has some benefits. There's not the exchange rate risk, but having many creditors, having many different creditors has its complications, and a lot of the creditors are maybe less willing to forgive debt than multilateral or bilateral lenders would have been in the past. So this creates challenges. The debt export ratio is more a liquidity measure in relation to debt, but again, we see African countries crossing what's regarded as an appropriate debt sustainability threshold and remaining above that level. And the chart on the right there just shows how many countries are above that level. So significant levels of questions about solvency. As said earlier, of course, in a situation where interest rates were low, then borrowing is more feasible and more sustainable. But as interest rates increase, this becomes much more of a problem. There's various other problems and challenges. African countries can issue bonds and try to borrow, but the African premium remains. It's more expensive for them to do so. With these increasing levels of debt, increasing amounts of government spending aren't servicing that debt, aren't paying interest. And that's really a challenge. And a lot of countries now are moving into situations of unsustainability in terms of debt. So the ones in red there are countries regarded as being in distress. The ones in yellow or orange at high level, in other words, not far away from being in debt distress. So a lot of countries, a lot of low-income countries, more than half of low-income countries are in debt distress or vulnerable, and some middle-income countries as well. There have also been a number of defaults on borrowing. Now, those defaults, of course, don't do anything to help the African premium. And sources of finance for countries have got increasingly difficult. But this, of course, has got important implications for fiscal policy. Lots of spending that government does is tremendously important. It's essential for growth and development. Over the last 15 years or so on, there's been significant improvement in building up human capital, in building up infrastructure and so on, and significant progress has been made. But there's a huge amount to do. African countries really need to invest in improving the quality of education. There's lots more to do in infrastructure, social protection, healthcare, many things. And these things matter for growth and development. This is really important. The elections have been talked about and the spending pressures that causes. We also know that Africa is a high inequality continent, and fiscal policy may be a way of trying to reduce that inequality. Fiscal policy is tremendously important, but faces a lot of challenges. We talked about, the chair mentioned that the average budget deficit for Africa is 4% of GDP. that is not a small number. If you think about how much government spending is of GDP, if you think about how much government revenue is relative to GDP, a deficit of 4%, that's a big number. That's a big number. Now, fiscal deficits, other things being equal, are going to contribute to increasing debt levels, as well as potentially being inflationary. So the ability to manage debts, to manage deficits rather, is really important. So the effective management of public spending is really important. Now, some governments have put in place programs to manage public sector spending more effectively, but there's a lot of progress to be made in that area. African countries also need to be looking to increasing levels of tax revenue. But that's not an easy thing to do, as the recent experience of Kenya shows us. There's limits to how much and how quickly tax revenue can be increased. But this is something that Africa needs to be doing by collecting more tax revenue. And of course, with all these deficits, of course, there can be pressure for public spending cuts. Now, global interest rates may get a bit lower, but we're not going to go back to where we were after the financial crisis. But for sure, African countries have need for new borrowing. They potentially have need for rescheduling or even forgiveness of existing debts. A few small initiatives have been made in this area, but that is a difficult process given the number of creditors. Given the difficulties of coordination, that's a difficult process. We were asked in the presentations to talk about 3 concrete actions which we think are important. And I think the first one has really got to be the critical need for African countries to be able to get more external support and/or, at least for some of them, some sort of debt rescheduling process. That seems to be critical. The public spending, the government spending is still tremendously important. Putting in place programs and really implementing effective public expenditure management programs, and also thinking about what are the expenditures that are the real priorities here and how to spend more effectively. And then I think over the longer term, thinking about a program to gradually increase the amount that governments are able to raise in tax revenue. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Mr. Andy. So I would like to invite Mr. Martin Kessler to talk us about the funding shortage or funding squeeze, if I may. So Mr. Martin Kessler, who is an executive director of the Finance for Development Lab at the Paris School of Economics. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So first of all, let me thank everyone at PCNS for inviting me to speak in this panel, and also the staff that was so welcoming. So thanks to you all. Second, I feel humbled to speak on this topic in front of so many experts. I wanted to present some ongoing reflection that we have based on proposals that we should already 6 months ago, and that we try to advance. And so I'm going to try to summarize the key points and also some ongoing reflection on the role of the IMF in managing, helping countries in consolidate. I didn't know that maybe would be here, so that makes it even more interesting to present this ongoing work. I'll go fast on this situation, basically on showing that we know that external debt has been rising, that domestic debt has been more important. There's still a large share of external debt and a lot of heterogeneity. I think what we try to stress is that although external debt stocks are high and have been rising, what's concerning is a very high level of debt service. And if you look at the underlying reasons, a lot of lower middle income and low income countries or classified at a risk of debt distress, it's often more because of the debt service is high in the coming few years. And that happens exactly at a time where refinancing is very difficult, especially on private markets. Let's keep that because we've been in the last session, in private markets, but also for the other major creditor, especially in African countries and lower middle income countries, which is China, and it's in non-Paris Club members in general. So this presents it's not only Africa, it covers lower and lower middle income countries, but a lot of African countries, and the picture is broadly the same for African countries. That, in 2022, we have the definitive numbers, but the figures probably worsen in 2023. There was outflows of capital or financing for governments. And so those long-term debt turned negative. They were very positive pre-COVID, with about 85 billion of dollars coming in lower and lower income countries, and it turned negative by $15 billion. And what explains that? It's mostly the private sector, bond markets. So there's been a lot of issuance in the 2010s, just before COVID and just after COVID, with a return in 2021. But that shifted with the rise in global interest rates, and there's been a lot more repayments than new loans. Actually, in 2022 and 2023, almost no European countries managed to issue and get in markets. It changed in 2024, but at very high rates. China, which had been a major lender, has been decreasing its loans and now has been becoming receiving more money than lending new money, and it's also a major change. That makes it very difficult. That means that the role of the international financial institutions, which is to provide new loans for projects, especially for multilateral development banks, actually tends to flow out. That the efficiency of official lenders and also other bilateral lenders, except China, is positive, but in net is flowing out of developing countries. That's very concerning. Even if it's linked to the fact that there's a high debt levels, but that also means that new debt is not generating growth, which, as we've seen, I think, in the previous discussion, is the main way to grow out of debt problems. And we try to classify, so the countries that you can't really read because it's white, but on a clear background. But the top two levels are flows in kind of the same analysis in percentage of GDP. And the two rows above are for countries that we deem illiquid, where the indicator of distress is that is sounding the alarm, let's say, is one on debt service. And so for those, you can see very well that international financial institutions are putting in money, and that the private sector and China is drawing out money, especially for 20 and 22. For countries that we deem insolvent, where the problem is the problem of stock, where the debt to GDP or the debt to GDP ratio is the one that is binding and that explains the level of debt distress. There, in a way, nobody's lending. The IMF is, if there's an agreement, but on net, there's net negative flows for everyone. Because I think in your introduction you also noted there's a lot of good news, and there's a lot of countries in the developing world, but also in Africa, that don't meet any of those, are not risky. Well, it's there's half that have high risk of debt distress, but half that are moderate or low. And for those, actually, money is still coming in, or was still coming in 2022, and it's probably continuing. So what we've been trying to argue for is to stop that outflow. To solve two problems. First, the inefficiency of official money going to repay private creditors in China. And second, because it doesn't allow to, it's inefficient, it's also in the long run probably impossible to maintain, especially high debt service is high, the size of the multilateral development banks and the IMF will not be sufficient to repay all these debts. So at some point, this strategy has to stop. There's a few solutions. Countries can restructure, and a few have done that. I think I won't go into the details of the common framework. We've seen that a few cases have accelerated the time that it takes from the IMF agreement to an actual agreement with the creditors has shortened, so there's been progress, but it's still daunting for policymakers. But given the tension, what I think is needed is a three-way deal where countries would commit to invest in adaptation in climate, because this is where most shocks are going to come from, to raise revenues, and at the same time have support from IFIs and an agreement with their other creditors to reschedule. And there's a few incentives to do that for creditors. Okay. So I think there's it's not the strategy being followed so far. I think the strategy being followed so far has been to put a lot of official money and hoping that in the next stage, and maybe even now, private creditors are going to come back. I think that this is a strategy that is becoming dangerous. First, because multilateral development banks have this commitment to increase their lending, but it's taking more time than I think we expected. There's a lot of progress on country platform, a lot of progress on the financial model of the multilateral development banks, but this increase is going slowly, and I think for leaders, finance ministers in developing countries, it's going too slowly. It doesn't allow them to finance new investments this year and the next. So there's this short-term problem that we need to bridge to before multilateral development banks are really able to support this growth. And the other element that so on which we have started doing research in on the role of the IMF, and the role of the IMF has been changing a lot. First, it has been doing a lot more. Obviously, there's a spike in programs, so that's the number of programs, and a lot more in Africa in particular. Spike in programs in 2020 because of COVID, a lot of rapid financing programs. But even on the long run, we've seen that where the IMF was present in Africa, but the share of African programs has risen, and the number is also present. So I think 27 countries in the program in 2023, and it's been increasing in 2024. The size of programs also increased, and I think there was this view that because countries in Africa are poorer, they borrow from the concessional part, the Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust. And because of reforms at the IMF, the quota limits have been increasing. Also because I think countries are increasing blending it with the non-concessional sources of financing from the IMF. So that has been helpful. That has allowed to support the strategy of refinancing, even though there's less financing coming from private markets. On the other side, there's also increase in the austerity, or let's call it consolidation required. So those are the average consolidation required at the onset of the program. So those are plans. Those are not actual policies, actual outcomes. Those are the plans that is agreed upon between the IMF and the country when it signed the program. And we see that the most recent batch of programs has been requiring more consolidation for a good reason. The deficit was much higher coming out of the pandemic, but also they're also faster. They require consolidation much more in the first year, which is really the first line that we see, and that can create political difficulties to achieve. And so the other element is that because the IMF has been lending more, it has required faster on overall consolidation. And this has made the question is whether it's sufficient to fill the financing gap. And it seems that given the high level of debt service, it will be difficult. So I think that's the result is that we need some contribution from other creditors. It can be under the form of rescheduling of new loans at affordable rates, and that can come with guarantees from multilateral development banks, and obviously the ongoing agendas of increasing financing from multilateral development banks is important, but not going fast enough. I stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Now we have our next speaker, Kwame Owino, Chief Executive Officer at the Institute of Economic Affairs, who will talk us about the Kenyan experience.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. And thanks to PCNS for this invitation and for hosting this conversation. Now, we're talking about fiscal discipline. I'll not just talk about Kenya, I'll just talk generally and a few things about Kenya that I have strong opinions on. I think the first question we need to ask ourselves is what drives unsustainable fiscal expansion. And I need to be circumspect, but I think fiscal expansion, if we wanted to understand what the fiscal expansion that has created the debt problems, or at least the debt distress that many African countries, sub-Saharan African countries are facing today, you'd have to go through a 30-year cycle. And in that 30 years, you realize two things. I think in the mid-1990s, when again, sub-Saharan Africa's debt problems became salient, and then of course there was a need for, beg your pardon, there was a need for adjustment. Many of them actually had a very serious problem with sustaining investment in public goods. And so there was underinvestment. When the recovery came about and everybody was talking about Africa rising, I think they overextended. And the metaphor that I and our colleagues use is that a period of starvation, we tried to compensate for a period of starvation by gluttony and feeding on debt. So that's partly what led to that. So very, very rapid fiscal expansion, debt growing at faster rates than the GDP was growing or even revenue. So that was bound to create problems regardless, because that's just simple mathematical reality. And then the second question was, I think we've all had this, but very irresponsible infrastructure investment. I think that many countries in sub-Saharan Africa started to believe their own hype. There's a recovery of growth, some of the fastest growing countries in the world in terms of GDP, even if from a low base or from the continent and further south. And so started to invest in infrastructure. In Kenya specifically, infrastructure, some of it did well, some of it did badly, and some of it are ugly. But nevertheless, the debt was accumulated, and it has to be paid when the piper comes. The third was choices in debt procurement. In my country, there were political reasons, but I think sometime towards mid-2000s, there was a view that African countries needed to diversify politically, for political reasons and others, choices for where debt would come from. And they said things such as, we are looking east. Some of it was political, some of it was just the zeitgeist, the culture of the moment. And so they actively abandoned concessional debt and started to take commercial debt. And the fourth is, with some growth happening, and many African countries started to draw long-term development plans, 30, 40-year plans, modeled on what happened in East Asia. And the belief was that an investment in infrastructure and huge government expansion in the economy was useful. Spending went ahead of taxes, and so taxes were forever chasing expenditure. So what I'm trying to say here is that these four questions, and I'm not saying they're the exclusive ones, they're the ones that I've identified. I think some apply to Kenya, some apply to the neighborhood, represent bad macroeconomic policy choices. And And when you take bad macroeconomic choices over a decade and more, and then it collides with global disasters, the outcome cannot be good. So that's basically what my diagnosis of this of the problem is. But let's not flog a dead horse. Let's come to what are the solutions. I disagree fundamentally with those who think that the response to fiscal consolidation in Africa has to be through an adjustment, which requires government to attract more revenue. I disagree. I come from a country in which the income per capita, based on World Bank data, on World Bank data is about $2,600, $2,700 per person per year. Now, the global shocks, especially about inflation, has made inflation, so if you could decompose the CPI basket, by dividing the food component with the non-food component, the non-food component is actually getting cheaper, or rather, inflation on the non-food component is below target. The food component is 30% higher than it was. So people are struggling to buy food. The lowest quintile of Kenya's population spends as much as 60% of their income buying food. Forget about when shocks happen, then it gets even worse. I don't think you're going to squeeze more taxes from those people without generating riots. I don't think so. I don't. So what you see today, as what happened last week, in my view, is a continuing story from last year when this was mostly politically driven. People were wearing saucepans on their heads and walking in the streets complaining about inflation and food inflation. And then, of course, that was resolved. But I think what we did was kick the problem back into the future. Now it's come full vengeance. And while the finance bill, because many people spoke about, in my view, was very reasonable. In fact, the finance bill for this year for Kenya, which is the the statutory program that government uses to add supplementary income, this year's was much better than last year. Last year's was atrocious. But I think here is where political management does come in. So part of managing a big transition program requires exceptional political skill, especially in a country in which everybody is Kenyans have very huge opinions about everything. So it requires exceptional skill. And yet government is juggling too many balls. You need to scale the stairs, right, and chew gum at the same time. I think they failed. Well-meaning as they were, that's part of what the problem here is. So the first thing in my view is actually to ask governments, especially in these parts of the world, if you look at it, 18% of GDP, I usually hear many people tell Africa that, well, Asian countries, other people spend 40% of GDP. Excuse me, I checked these numbers. When the UK and Germany had an income per capita of $2,800, federal government was 10% of GDP. Kenya is 50% higher than that. So I don't agree with this plucking of numbers and saying these governments need to be bigger. They need to, but in my view, they're going to get bigger by efficiencies in tax collection that generates new revenue, not by raising tax rates. Because that's politically difficult, even in the best of circumstances. Whether you have elections tomorrow or not, it's a very politically difficult thing to push forth. So what do they do? In my view, one of the things that governments, the first is basically in terms of solutions and country solutions. First, I think go back to basic public goods, the pure public goods that are required. Government, I say this advisedly, is not Father Christmas buying everything that we want, concentrating on public goods. And in Kenya, we could see it again this year. To mention rough numbers, government of Kenya was spending equivalent of 1.8 trillion, just about $15 billion to pay debt, and about $6 billion for all education, which educates 15 million kids. So people feel the pinch in the fact that, public goods are being underfunded, which is one of the most successful programs in Kenya's history, public education, and here we are paying debt, regardless of the fact that, of course, this money had been spent and gotten before. So governments just have to go back to being honest with people and funding the public goods that have the biggest footprint in the country. So that's one. The second, obviously, is government on the infrastructure side needs to do better return on investments and a cost effectiveness of the infrastructure. because this infrastructure, we have a whole motley, and some of my colleagues, interns at the IEA tried to put a list. In the last 15 years, the government of Kenya tried to build, I kid you not, close to 18 stadiums in different levels of completion. 18 stadiums for sports and that kind of stuff. So refocusing government on public goods would be a good thing, because public goods spent well usually generate goodwill for government and actually generate more sustainable. Finally, and this is the difficult one, is because paying for debt in Kenya's constitutional order requires a compact between the executive and the legislature, it is very political. And I think Kenya's legislature over the last, the National Assembly over the last 10 years simply conceded to the executive everything about debt. So in those same years that I spoke about, Kenya's debt ceiling, we had a debt ceiling, was adjusted upwards 7 times. Every time the Treasury came and pleaded for the expansion to be done, it was done without much. So I think as those who live here, I think it might help in other parts to actually reestablish the compact and the oversight mechanisms that arms of government have to check each other. And of course, the bigger R. Some countries, in my view, are not going to make it, especially if there's another global shock, God forbid, or touch wood, it should not happen. They need to seek early write-offs or a restructuring of that. So it's important. It's the worst situation, but it's not as if the world will end if one country seeks to restructure, but with restructuring sooner than later. So what have I said? In the end, in my view, all this will depend on helping sub-Saharan African governments especially, to be competent in the diagnosis about what the macroeconomic challenges are and execute the right policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kwame. Thank you all for your presentation and for respecting the time. We have 40 minutes left, so we can start the Q&A session. We will start by a first round of 4 or 5 questions, then allow the speakers to respond, and then we can come back for a second round of questions. We start. Yes.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to ask a question. So my name is Seydina Alioune. I'm an economist and I'm an associate of a consultancy firm in Senegal dedicated to financing transportation infrastructure in Africa. So I have one question. When we talk about fiscal discipline, I reckon that it's important to put into fact that in Africa, our landscape, our economy landscape, we have around 90 to 95% of our economy, which is in the so-called informal sector. For example, in Senegal, we have 400,000 business units, and 97% of those business units are informal. So and we know that when you are informal, you have no balance sheet, no fiscal duties at all, no fiscal discipline. So in your point of view, how can we tackle this issue of this predominant informal sector in the economy landscape of Africa? This is my question, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Oui, bonsoir à tous. Je voudrais féliciter les panélistes parce qu'ils nous ont vraiment éclairés. Et je voudrais parler surtout de l'endettement de nos pays. Je voudrais savoir, est-ce que les pays peuvent vraiment éviter de se surendetter ou bien de s'endetter parce que on se rend compte que comment on doit financer le développement dans nos pays, vu qu'on ne peut pas mobiliser l'épargne, et on sait qu'aussi il y a la résistance à la diversification de nos économies. Alors qu'on a besoin de financer quand même le changement climatique, financer beaucoup d'éléments, les routes et tout cela, comment faire quand on sait qu'il y a toujours des déficits au niveau des budgets, etc. Donc je voudrais avoir quelques recettes pour éviter le surendettement et comment financer le développement dans nos pays. Merci. Je suis Madame Barry de la Côte d'Ivoire. Merci.
Merci, Madame. We have on my left, please. We have another question here.
Thank you so much. First, I would like to thank the panelists for being with us today, and also for the quality of the presentation. So my question is regarding the whole theme of innovative finance. So we've been talking about options regarding fiscal discipline for the African continent, such as rescheduling of debts, concessional debts, and we've also talked about forgiveness, which is somehow an extreme case. So I would like to ask the panelists if they have any other options that come along this theme of innovative finance, and how to qualify the options that they already mentioned. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and thank you to the panel for these great interventions. I guess my question is, it's a general one. It picks up on the previous point, but it's probably directed to Martin in the first instance. In terms of expanding the balance sheets of the MDBs, do you think there's scope for doing more with the recycling of the SDR issue from 2022? We've seen commentary on this from various institutions, mainly in the US, about SDR-denominated bonds at the World Bank, or further recycling through the fund, or hybrid capital, the African Development Bank. Do you have a view on the prospects of this as a possible form of innovative financing?
Thank you.
Sorry, Marcus Freitas from Brazil, Policy Center, Senior Fellow. My question was addressing the issue that he has raised about informality. I live in China, and you know WeChat and Alipay have been very good platforms in which you can bring many people into the whole system. So how can the digital economy somehow change and start, getting everybody inside the system, which is always a challenge that you have? How far and how much we should push for the digital economy, for digital paper, digital money to be the new reality in order to address many of these issues? Thank you.
Thank you. I think we'll keep these 4 questions and give the floor to the panelists to have their reactions. We'll keep the same order of passage. Mr. Andy.
Let me try and pick up 1 or 2 of the points here. And maybe sort of the first and the last question about informality and the digital economy. And of course, these are realities of the environments in which we're operating. And as you say, the vast majority of economic activity is in the informal sector. And of course, the informal sector is more difficult to tax and more difficult to regulate. But it's not that it's not taxed. It's not that it's not that taxes are not raised in the informal sector. The challenges of there's been a lot of efforts to try to encourage formalization, but that's been pretty unsuccessful, and I'm not sure that that's a particularly productive way of moving, desirable as it might be. And the growth of the digital economy is for certain a reality, and potentially it's an opportunity. And the digital economy could also be digital. The digital economy. Lots of countries have now done important innovations in trying to raise tax revenues through digital channels and things like that. So I think we definitely do need to look at ways in which we can engage with the digital economy in trying to address some of these issues. I still think some of the big fiscal policy issues are not necessarily touched by either of these things, but there definitely are points of connection here. We stop there.
You have a question on balance sheet on MDBs and
Yeah.
maybe innovative finance that you can link with the second question of climate transition financing.
Right, yes, on the use of SDRs, that's been a lot of hope on using the SDR, so the special drawing rights issued by the IMF that were mostly allocated to rich countries that don't need them, and that have been looking for ways to reallocate them. The first way they've done that is through the IMF, through the fund for concessional lending, the PRGT, and the new fund that was established especially for to channel those SDRs, the Resilience and Sustainability Trust. And yes, there's definitely a role for multilateral development bank as conduit for SDRs. The African Development Bank has come up with a proposal that would allow to rechannel them and leveraging them. I think the practical, the principle I think is completely convincing. The practical issues with the very strange nature of special drawing rights, which are reserve assets that some central banks want to keep as reserve assets, and the argument of the African Development Bank that it would maintain the reserve asset status as not going typically the European Central Bank. And so, it's been something that's been advancing very slowly. The IMF recently issued a board paper that consider that with some limits, it could be used as hybrid capital, and so that might advance. I think there's also a very strong case for, especially given those limitations for central banks that are not able to rechannel as hybrid capital. I think the idea of using bonds and denominated in SDR settled in currency could be appealing for typically the ECB. It could be a way for example, IDA to lower its cost of borrowing and access stable financing. So I think that it's promising. There's ongoing discussions about the replacement of IDA and how to get to a size that would allow to more linked countries, and so I think that's something that definitely important in this cycle. On innovative financing, I see there's quite a lot of innovations, whether it's has the size needed to solve the problems of countries that are in a very difficult liquidity situation. I'm not sure, but there's been the use of for example, debt for nature swaps that have helped, mostly in Latin America, but there's also one in Gabon, that have helped manage some liquidity woes, and it's important. That's a way. It's not a way to reduce debt, and so it's not a way for countries that are facing the most acute debt crisis, but it's a good way to reduce debt pressure in a given year, and to allocate it to usage that can be that have so far been on conservation of nature, forests, or oceans, but that could be very well for education as well. So this kind of innovation, and more broadly, I think there's a lot of investors that would be interested in taking in lending with I would say credible green bonds with green characteristics, and we do so probably with a premium to emerging economies. But the problem is the credibility, and so the developing instruments like sustainability-linked bonds, where countries get or have targets that they can meet, developing green bonds that are more credible and are now would be important, and are ways to lower the cost of funding. It won't change everything, but it can lower the cost of funding for some governments.
Well, it's very, very difficult for me to actually, and this I realized much, much later as I started to work in policy, that some of that distinction between informal and formal sector is very artificial. So maybe the way a benign policymaker looks at it is, these are all sources for jobs. And some jobs require a regular work structure with an office, and these others require a different kind. So I think, and increasingly many African policymakers do not think that informal sector is a smear word for low, dirty, and stuff like that. They're just seeing it as, look, here are people with a scarcity of resources. They need to run a business. They try to run it on very, very thin margins, try to limit their risks as much as is possible. For that reason, they're not going to set up a big building and that. Now, if you think about it in that way, and I'm glad it's been mentioned as well, yes, the informal sector pays taxes in different ways from the formal sector. And one of the things we need to persuade authorities and people who work in public sector in sub-Saharan African, perhaps low-income countries, is that it's futile to design a tax system as if you're in Germany for a country such as Kenya, where 3/4 of the working people work in the informal sector. So your tax system needs to be designed to respond to the structure of the economy. And the real structure of the economy is it's very heavy on the informal sector side, even if some of those incomes are low, they're irregular, and that. And I think they do. Kenya does, in my view, Kenya does a decent job with that, because most of these taxes then are collected through consumption and the services that are consumed by people who work in the informal sector. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think a structural transformation is a very difficult thing to achieve. As you achieve it over time, that story is definitely going to change, because historically that's how it's happened. So if you have most of your people in farms and the other people in smaller trading, then perhaps that is it. Whenever these people deploy technology, I am very conscious about, again, learned from being in Kenya, that we should never think of technology as, especially IT and digital, as some kind of silver bullet. There'll just be a consumption. They can use it where it's necessary to give them efficiencies on the job, whether to transfer money or to receive payments very, very quickly. That's it. But I think part of that is if government concentrated on transformation, making factor markets work. I'm not saying they're easy. Making factor markets work. The infrastructure is available, is here. Reduce the costs of starting businesses and running businesses. Over time, I think that transition will happen without having to consider it like some part of the economy to be embarrassed about. And finally, in my view, in the last 12 years, one of the things that I lament about sub-Saharan African countries is they lost an opportunity, including Kenya, for lightening the burden of the state through privatization. Because this is what happens. It's a difficult political economy problem. When it's as bad as it is now, it's very difficult to push governments to privatize, because they're saying, we are going to lose money, we are going to give our crown jewels for zero. When they're running well, they say, but we are running it well, why should we give it? So it's a really, really difficult political economy thing. And in my view, if governments simply committed to the fact that our main goals, outside shocks that are unforeseen or are very bad, is to run the traditional public goods, we'd see more competence, more minds led to the main things that need to happen. And in my view, the productivity growth that would come from that would be enormous. Thanks.
If I can just, I think we missed the question on the need for debt. I think it's a good question. So why, how can we how can we grow given all the needs of developing countries. And I think it's important to make the point that that is not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, it's sort of by definition, I think developing countries have relatively low savings, have a lot of needs, and so they need to import the capital that they need from, often from external sources, from external sources, and so they can do it a little bit on the form of investment, of equity investment, of foreign direct investment, but part of it has to do with debt, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think the essential thing is then how much growth does it create and at what horizon. So if you do investment in education, the returns are very long. You need to train people, it takes 5 years, or 10, they need to get on the job market, so the returns are long, but that's why we have the multilateral development banks that do loans on the very long term and at concessional rates. On some other infrastructure, it can be faster and it can be financed through private capital. But then you need to make sure that this growth is actually coming, and then can be productive of new revenues for the private sector or the government. But growing with that it's not necessarily a bad thing. It just has to be well managed.
Thank you for your feedback. I think we can take a couple of questions. Yes.
Thank you very much for your excellent presentation. My question would be, we are dealing about fiscal discipline in a global environment where macroeconomic constraints become major critical issues. But we are talking about a continent with over 50 countries, quite different from South African economy to, let's say, Guinea-Bissau or Kenya and Sao Tome. So how can this generic prescription and solutions we are referring be applicable to this diverse environment? Shouldn't we, the solutions and the possible nature of fiscal discipline, shouldn't we try to relate with the conditions on the ground? I think on Kenya you were referring about the political environment. So my question is for policymakers to make it relevant for policymakers. What do we advise? How they can relate with their peculiar national conditions?
Thank you so much for the presentations. I have a question, I think, related mainly to the presentation of Martin, because you mentioned at a certain point that the loans, both the size and the number of loans of the IMF have been growing over time. So I was wondering to what extent this is related to the fact that the loans are not working in African countries with all this literature on the recidivism of African countries, or that the demand for loans has been increasing given that we have more external shocks. And this leads me to the second part of the question, to what extent all the conditionality has to be revisited in the sense that it has been primarily focusing on macro stabilization, which is mainly the mandate of the IMF, but at the same time, most of the structural benchmarks are always either vague or not effectively implemented, which again weakens the role of the IMF loans. So just want to know what's your intake on that. Thank you so much.
Is there any other question? Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Mingming from the Chinese Embassy. Thank you for the excellent presentation. Maybe it's just a comment or observation, because For the debt in Africa, one thing is very important is that according to some statistics, in some countries, the growth of the debt itself is much faster than the economic growth of the country. And for example, in some southern part of the Sahara countries, the growth of the debt is twice as much as that of the economic growth. And the second point is, Martin just mentioned that the structure of the debt changed a little bit. As in terms of the public debt, maybe 40% is the multilateral one, and 40% is commercial and EU bond, and only 20 kind of a bilateral one. So the private bond holders, they were occupied almost 50 or 60% of all the debt payment. And so for China, we attach great importance to the debt issue of the continent, and we would like to play our part in this concern. And also we take an active part in the G20 framework, and we will continue to do so. And apart from that, personally, I think we should also try to do something. First is that we should try to make more linkage between the debt and issue of development of the country. And the second is that we should do more preventive measures in terms of bilateral bond adjustment. And the third one is that we should try to combine the bilateral and the multilateral methods. Try to, for example, at the very beginning, to add more liquidity and then try to sort it out in the long and medium term. And the last point is that we should try to optimize the international bond or maybe debt governance system to make it more balanced, have some more reform in the, for example, the G20, Paris Club. We should maybe urge the multilateral institute to burden more duties in this regard. Anyway, the Forum of China-Africa Forum will be hosted in Beijing in this September, and we will be very willing to know more about the concerns and worries of the continent, and we hope that we can do our part as much as we can in the sustainable development of the continent. Thank you.
Mr. Andy, yes?
Okay, thank you for those questions. Let me try and pick up on some of the points. And first of all, maybe on China. I mean, China is a tremendously important actor in relation to Africa, and of course, there's lots positive. There's lots positive from that, and China brings its own approach and its own perspective, and that I think is very welcome. And the fact that China is having these meetings with African countries is a really positive development. We need this diversity, and that's a very positive thing. You also made the point about the increasingly complex nature of debt, that there's many different types of debt, and that's certainly true. That creates some complications, especially in terms of trying to manage those debts and so on. But I think that is an important issue in trying to navigate this debt question. Now, Akebe's point, I think, my presentation was very high level in the sense that it was sort of talking about Africa as a whole, so to speak. And of course, there's huge amount of heterogeneity, and the fact that some countries are in debt distress or close to it means that lots of other countries are not in debt distress or not close to it. And so the diagnosis ought to be different. Now, some of the countries that are not in debt distress may later come into debt distress, but their current situation is very different, and so it's definitely not a case of one size fits to everything rather. And to add to that, we really have to consider the political realities. And, the case of Kenya, and it's very good that, Kwame's presentation very much took a very different approach and took lots of examples from one particular country. And I think we need that. We need the sort of overview, but we need the detailed understanding and lessons that we can learn from a particular country context, including this question of political reality. So the point about heterogeneity, I think, is totally accepted. Thank you.
I just wanted to I was thinking, listening to your question, that maybe we're not generalizing enough. So, large deficits that are not managed, and elections that come to disrupt, very fragile fiscal balances. I come from France. I know about that. The election in the US. So, it's not. I think it's problem of fiscal discipline institutions is actually global. Obviously, there's a lot of differences across the context, but it's actually something that goes way beyond Africa. On the question on the growth in IMF lending, I think it's both, both in a way demand and supply. There were two huge external shocks, COVID. And then the increase in interest rates, the war in Ukraine, that created a lot of demand for emergency support. And on the other side, there were a lot of reform at the IMF that allowed to provide that support both in breadth and in size. And then I agree. I think there's a focus on macroeconomic stabilization that is by design in IMF program. The role, especially for both that restructuring, but also in those contexts, for a lot more coordination across international financial institutions. And it's been advancing. The fact that the role of the IMF and the World Bank and the African Development Bank are very different, and that to allow the World Bank to lend a lot more during crisis would allow to have destabilization, but also long-term focus on long-term growth. And just one point on the question of China. I mean, the participation of China, I completely agree. There's been a lot of I think efforts in participating in the common framework, in the G20 common framework, a lot of progress. We've seen that the deals are going faster. The agreement in Ghana recently, in Sri Lanka, which is not a common framework country, but where there was also coordination between the Chinese treatment and of debt to Sri Lanka and the official creditor committee. So there's been a lot of progress on that. Still, I mean, I think what's been different has been how large and how fast both the increase in lending under the BRI and then the decline, and that I think that's creating problems. But I think there's also, I mean, with the FOCA coming, I think there's also a lot of potential to rethink the relationship and see, what's not lending. There's been a lot of lending, sometimes productive on infrastructure, sometimes that has created less growth, and refocus on trade, on investments. I think will change a lot of things.
Okay, two things. Yes, I think this question of heterogeneity and the discussion about sub-Saharan Africa or the whole of Africa as if it's one country is I think the public discourse around this is getting better. People recognize that Africa is classified in very different ways. So Kenya is completely different from Sao Tome and definitely from Cape Verde and that. But there are certain things that are principles. There are certain macroeconomic principles that regardless of the size of the country or the territory, if they're violated, trouble's coming down the way. So one of those is basically, of course, someone's mentioned, if your debt is growing and the interest rates are higher than GDP growth rates, and the debt is growing as well, it's a certainty that it's going to be a problem in the future. It's a certainty. And it even comes sooner if there's a shock that you cannot control for, because that's happened. And that happened to Kenya in 2020 when those, all remember, the sad pandemic. Kenya had been on that path, an explosive fiscal path. And then the shock comes, and countries that had run more sensible macroeconomic policies had the opportunity to actually use buffers at that time to expand. Kenya did not have the fiscal space. And so Kenya's response, thankfully, that of course the vaccine came sooner and all that, Kenya's response was actually very tame. The fiscal policy response in terms of trying to get a stimulus was much, much smaller than it could have been. In our view, and our assessment was it could have been bigger. But we had to accept, and the authorities had to accept, we have no space. So that's basically it. Those are principles. They're not about the size of the economy and all that. And if you think about African countries, most of which are small open economies, they're small and they're open, you're more vulnerable to global shocks and all that. So you are even required to be more prudent. Prudence cannot be a luxury to an African country, let me say a sub-Saharan country, African country with a gross domestic product, per capita income of $3,000 per person. If there's a shock, such as somebody has borne a grudge in Eastern Europe and decides to cross a border and attack another country, whatever might be the merits of it, food prices go up, we in Kenya get the problem immediately, regardless of whose fault it is. So what that tells you is that if you realize that you're in this ocean and our boat is smaller, then we are required to be even more vigilant. And for us, prudence cannot be a luxury. It cannot be. So and I think that would apply for most of those countries. So let me end with this. There's a Paris club which talks about, which is a club of lenders. And I think we left in one thing here. There needs to be a club of borrowers as well. And of course, as part of international financial architecture reforms, these are some of the things that are being discussed. But for two reasons. One, some of the biggest commercial loans that the government of Kenya procured were not transparently declared to Parliament or to people. And that's part of what's generating this view. I don't think there's anything fishy about it, but financial transactions with commercial players is completely a different ballgame. And it usually requires some vigilance, some competence that many African countries seemed not to have had, or at least were not as reflective on. When you're dealing with multilateral players, those loans and the tenure are usually declared. So you don't even have to search for it. It'll be declared in a statement, and if you can interpret, you already interpret it. This needs to change. And it's not going to change until the borrowers come together and actually have some muscle to negotiate with commercial borrowers. And of course, there are also countries which have development banks which themselves behave as if they are commercial enterprises, saying that this loan cannot be declared, the contracts cannot be declared, but you guys pay nevertheless. That's not very good for in a political season in which the administration is besieged and everybody is searching for a reason to blame them for corruption and to blame them for this. So that's making African countries fragile, and I think, in my view, a borrowers club needs to be put together, and we'll say we will declare it to members of this club so that one country doesn't get intimidated by quote unquote big global commercial players or others. Thanks.
So we have reached the end of our session. Again, I would like to thank our panelists for their intervention. I would like also to thank the audience for the attention and for the reactivity. See you tomorrow for the next session. Thank you.